We finally have our first trumper.
Hello and welcome back to Digital Dialectics with me, Jonathan Herzog, and this week's guest, Rob Henderson. Welcome, Rob.
Hello, Jonathan.
So good to see you.
It's good to be here.
By way of introduction, Rob Henderson is an all-star. If you don't know who he is yet, you are in for a ride. Rob is a Ph.D. student and Gates Cambridge Scholar at the University of Cambridge. He received a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from Yale, is a veteran of the U.S. Air Force. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Quillette, and among many other outlets. His main area of research is in moral psychology. He primarily investigates how peripheral factors can influence moral judgments. Rob is also a mentor for Service to School, an organization that helps veterans earn admission to college. You can follow him on Twitter at Rob K. Henderson and sign up for his popular newsletter about human nature online. And with that, welcome, Rob.
Hey, Jonathan. Thank you.
Awesome. So let's dive right in. And there's so much I am so excited to get into with you. But I think maybe we can start with your story. Because I think I remember, so I studied psychology as well. And one of the things we were always told to avoid was what they called me-search, right? So research that emanates from personal experience. But I think for our purposes, it would really be informative to share your own personal story and how you got to where you are.
Yeah. Thanks for that introduction and everything. I don't really think I'm doing that much research, but maybe some of the viewers or others could tell me maybe if I'm missing something. Just a very long story short, I was born in poverty in Los Angeles, spent a lot of time in foster homes. Later was adopted, but then my adoptive parents got divorced and there was a custody dispute, and I was basically just raised by my adoptive mother because my father basically just didn't want to talk to us anymore. And then my mother fell in love with a woman, and I was raised by her and her partner sort of throughout my adolescence. And there were just a series of family tragedies. My mother's partner, who sort of became a surrogate mother to me, she was shot. There was a bunch of, sort of drama. And, eventually we got an insurance settlement as a result of that accident. She survived and used this money to invest in the real estate market in California. But this was 2007. And so basically they invested this money and no one was buying houses. And so ended up losing everything. Our house was foreclosed. And I mean, there's a lot of other stuff here, but basically my early life was a mess and I was not a good student. Definitely was not on any kind of college track. So I ended up joining the military and sort of found my bearings there and ended up attending Yale on the GI Bill and ended up somehow here at Cambridge.
Wow. So if you're open to it, can we kind of fold back some of those key junctures or kind of forks in the road where perhaps it seems like you sort of ending up in the military became this really powerful juncture? And I want to quote you, if that's all right. Yeah. And you said in the New York Post, the military directs the impulses of young people, especially young men, into more productive pursuits. So given your upbringing and experience, how did you even draw that bridge towards the Air Force?
Yeah. I mean, I was always kind of like a curious kid, an adventurous kid. I just got in a lot of trouble too. And the military looked like, something that, it was just appealing to me because of the structure, because of the chance to leave the small town that I was growing up in too. Even though I was born in LA, I was later sort of adopted and moved to Red Bluff, California, which is this really small town. And I noticed that the adults that I tended to respect and admire, my friend's father, he was a police officer, but before that, he was in the Air Force. I sort of respected him. I admired him. One of my teachers in high school had been in the military before, and he actually sort of told me, I think the military would be a good idea for you. even though this was, again, like 2007, 2008, that time where we were still at war, there was still a lot of uncertainty about Iraq and Afghanistan. But when I would talk to other adults, and this sort of reveals my more, I guess, rebellious side, especially at that age, I tell adults, I'm thinking about joining the military, and I would see these reactions of like, oh my God, no, there's, you could die. What about Iraq? And George Bush is evil. And, they would just like have all these reactions. And I would say like, okay, well, if they don't like it, then I got to do it, because I just kind of like that they don't like it. And this, told me, this could be fun. My mom didn't like it either, but, eventually she came around. But the military itself, I've thought about this before, and the obvious lesson that a lot of people draw, and even people who don't serve can kind of get this, is the military instills discipline. There's a lot of camaraderie. Everyone has a common mission, and a lot of the differences between people sort of become stripped away, because basically everyone's wearing the same uniform, and you're basically like conditioned from basic training that the mission comes first. These are your brothers and sisters, and we are all on the same team. And so, of course, those were very powerful for me, and I learned a lot. But another sort of less discussed aspect of the military, at least in my view, is just the benefit, and this is particularly for young men, like I wrote in that piece, of being in a place that basically you can't act out. There are predictable consequences for doing stupid things. So, if I'm like, when I was 17, I was doing a lot of dumb things. And, a lot of the reason I'm here is just because I'm lucky. Like, there were times where I should have died or been in jail, but I just got really lucky. But in the military, you can't do those things, right? There's every aspect of your life is controlled.
But I thought you said, Rob, that we shouldn't attribute our outcomes to luck. Isn't that part of the fallacy of the elite, the kind of self-preservation luxury belief? And I don't want to,
Yeah. No. That's a good point. Well, I mean, there are. I think when it comes to certain kinds of success, of course, luck plays a role in everything that we do. But it's also a matter of what we tend to emphasize, what we tend to stress. Right. I mean, I think a lot of people in the elite stress the luck aspect. Oh, I just got lucky, and I'm just fortunate, and maybe I don't really deserve this. But, for me, luck did play a role simply because I'm alive. I mean, that's kind of lucky. So, yeah, I think it's just a matter of what we stress. And I do tend to stress a lot of the other parts of what I did to end up here, too.
Totally. And I don't want to jump the gun, because I want you to help us kind of introduce the concepts that you're working in social psychology and in luxury beliefs. But I don't want to paper over, kind of your personal narrative and experience and really triumph. And again, just kind of as it relates to you and your journey, I mean, how would you say in these moments of hyper trauma, right? Truly trauma in the objective sense, not in the sort of concept creep notion of trauma we're used to now. I mean, how has that informed your perspective? But also, again, in those particular moments, what got you through? I mean, it's quite trite, but like, how did you get through those moments of trauma? If you can like recall any particular moments.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say like exactly what it was. There were some adults along the way who I was close with, who kind of understood the situation that I was in. I had some teachers, some coaches, people who sort of like took me under their wing and said like, look, like basically you don't really understand, like, because a lot of other kids in my high school and in my town also kind of came from working class, kind of rough backgrounds, although maybe not quite to the level as what I was in. Some coaches and teachers and stuff, they would say things like, look, you don't really know what you're in right now. And they were right, because to me, this was just my life, actually. I mean, there were like very sort of painful periods for sure. But generally speaking, that was just life for me and for a lot of foster kids, for a lot of kids who are poor or working class. We don't really like sit around and think like, wow, like we really are in a traumatic situation, aren't we? Like we're just sort of like, this really sucks,
It just
but you
is.
just gotta get through it, right? Like you just gotta sort of take it day by day. And you know, for young guys like me, especially, I mean, like we dealt with it. You know, how did we get through it? Well, we dealt with it by drinking, by fighting, by doing drugs, by, you know, just beating the shit out of each other and like vandalizing buildings, like just sort of doing really dumb things. And, you know, in the moment, it's a lot of fun. And if you asked us why you're doing it, why are you doing these things? We say, well, because it's fun and whatever, like we like pissing people off and so on. But if you really sort of dig deeper into why are young guys acting out? Why would a 15-year-old boy act out that way? A lot of it is because there's like basically no real adult supervision. No one really knows what's going on at home. No one really is checking in on his grades or how he's doing in school, or yeah, there's just very little expectation of him.
Absolutely. There is so much here and so many kind of meta levels that draw upon your personal experience, but even on and extending to the policy level, because on a national level, and you've really written about this really potently and compellingly, that nearly half of all children are born to single mothers in the United States. And you also describe by the data, the outcomes of foster children in particular. But I want to pull from something you wrote recently as well, which is you say, educated people ask how we can get more underprivileged kids into college. That's a laudable goal, but education is a red herring. And, you know, it's interesting, Rob, because there's certainly many out there who might say, well, isn't the answer, Rob, just more pipelines, more pathways, more fellowships, more scholarships to Yale, right? Like, look what Rob became, you know, a veteran scholar, you know, doctoral candidate. And yet you maintain this level of objectivity to say, well, actually, seldom do people even mention parents or family. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to say that, like, look, all of those things are important. And like I say, it is a laudable goal. You know, I'm not going to complain if people say, like, let's get more foster kids into college. I support that 100%. But the thing is, like, even if every foster kid gets into Yale, like, they're going to be carrying scars from their childhood, right? Like, it took me a while to sort of like process, like, after I became an adult and everything, to like process like what that was like. Once I started meeting people who didn't have that kind of life, right? Like once I joined the military and sort of met like middle class people and people who just didn't live in like a bunch of different foster homes and stuff, like, wow, that was really like a completely, like, that is just like a very distressing period for a kid. And so, yeah, even if all the foster kids in America get into Yale or Harvard, like I know you went to, like, it's just not going to sort of make everything better, right? Like, and I think if you asked a lot of kids, you know, would you rather go to college or would you rather have a stable and caring family? They would choose the family. And the fact that there's so much focus on education, in my view, is because the affluent in America, they don't like underplay or downplay the importance of family, but they just sort of are so focused on credentials and on, you know, getting the right diplomas and the right internships and so on. And they basically take their families for granted, right? Like, it doesn't enter their equation. It's like, a loving family is what is it, like the water you swim in, right? The old joke, you ask a fish, like, you know, whatever about the water, and he's like, what's water? I think a lot of affluent people are like that with their families because they grew up in intact families and everyone they knew. I mean, like, it just blew my mind. So many people at Yale, including veterans. So Yale has like a handful of former veterans too, like me, who attended after they served. All the veterans that I knew grew up with two-parent families. Here at Cambridge, it's kind of the same way with every single person that I've met. I tell this story in one of the pieces that I've written. I was in a class at Yale. There were 20 students, including me, maybe 25. And there was this like anonymous survey the professor did asking us about, you know, whether you grew up in a two-parent family or a single-parent family, something like that. And the only two people who did not grow up in a two-parent family were me and one other student, right, out of 25 people. And that is not the norm. And if you look at America as a whole, and certainly not the norm if you look at the working class. I had 5 close friends in high school, like my 5 like core group of guys or whatever. None of us were raised by two parents. Some of us were raised in foster homes. Some of us were raised by like a grandmother. Some of us were raised by like, by basically one parent, but not both. And so it's just a completely different experience by social class.
Absolutely. So I don't want to get caught up too much in the critique, because I think it's very important, and you give us a vocabulary that we may not have had otherwise. But I think so much of this kind of movement and the set of ideas and policies that emanate from it is, how do we offer an alternative? How do we offer a true programmatic alternative that moves beyond the critique? But I think you offer this really solid foundation upon which we can build that alternative. So I want to just fully flesh out and just like start, back at the beginning of your theory of luxury beliefs, and just walk us through how you landed upon this, beginning with your work in psychology, what it actually means, and kind of break it down to the bare bones. And then we can get to what the implications might be.
Yeah. I mean, there was not like a specific moment where it all sort of snapped in focus, but it was like incremental reading and learning about, incentives, for example, in social sciences, whether psychology or economics, what drives people. Typical response is money, right? Like if you pay people, they'll sort of, do something for money. But at least in psychology, the aspect of what drives human behavior that I find particularly interesting is social status. If you look at basically like when people are most satisfied or most happy, it's not the people who have the most money overall. It tends to be people who have the most money in their local area, sort of relative income, not absolute income. So if you have the most in your neighborhood, you'll be happier, even if you're not a millionaire. And so that was interesting to me, the sort of local element of social status. And this was because, especially at Yale, when I started really, sort of diving deep into this, because a lot of Yale students were like anxious and stressed out and like, wondering if they're going to get that internship or get that job or whatever. And like, to me, being at Yale was like, how, like, I even to this day, I still can't quite believe that I went there. And so while I was there, I'm like, wow, like, but all these kids are like so stressed out, and I'm wondering like, what is it? And I think to them, it's because, who cares you got into Yale? Everyone around you is at Yale. You were expected to go to Yale, and everyone around you is doing all these amazing things. And so it's this local environment of status driving nonstop. So that was interesting to me. The other thing was like, basically, like, how do people display their status? And, I was reading Thorstein Veblen. I had read Paul Fusel's book, Class. A little bit of Pierre Bourdieu, although his is a little bit more impenetrable, but like these kind of sociologists and how they described social class distinctions. And they focused on luxury goods, sort of what you wore, the sort of hobbies and activities you engage in. So, if you're wearing a tuxedo or a nightgown, or you have a certain kind of watch, if you play golf or go beagling, like, this is sort of like early 20th century, mid 20th century stuff here. And I found that interesting too, that like, oh, okay. I mean, it sort of intuitively made sense, but then seeing it explicitly laid out this way, people wear different clothes and people can pick up on status in this way. But I think what's different today is that a lot of material goods are more affordable, right? I mean, not across the board, but things like everyone has a smartphone now. Everyone can get a laptop, and I'm somewhat overgeneralizing, but basically it's become sort of easier to obtain material goods. And I also think that at least among the affluent, there's this, at least among some people, like this minimalist aesthetic, this reluctance to display material goods because it's seen as gauche or, you're trying too hard, right? And so I think that these two things, right, the fact that it's easier to obtain goods and the affluent are sort of more apprehensive about displaying it, but they still want to display their status in some way. They want to differentiate themselves. So how do I do this if I can't sort of wear a top hat and a monocle or something? Like, how am I going to show people that I'm still above them? And I think people do this by sort of rearranging and updating opinions and beliefs and vocabulary, these things that are a little bit more ephemeral, but that are still status markers nonetheless. And I noticed this at Yale. I mean, early on, there was a sort of, a vocabulary barrier that I didn't quite get. I mean, a simple example of this was, and I've told this story before, is like the word gendered. I had no idea what that meant, but someone casually dropped it in a conversation, and I was like, what does that even mean? I heard other kinds of like ways of speaking using words like you said, like dramatic, in ways that I had never heard it applied before. The whole concept creep idea. There were all of these like different ways of speaking and ways of thinking that were foreign to me when I got to Yale. And when I tried to communicate some of this to like friends back home, like guys I grew up with or my family and stuff, like, they were just as bewildered as me. And so this kind of clicked. Like, this is sort of when it all started to come together. Like, okay, so people care about status, but they need a new way to do it. And so therefore they sort of reattach it to beliefs.
So this is so fucking fascinating. And I want to dive deep and press the theory and really go into some concrete examples. But I want to first, just taking that like first line of the notion that physical needs or material consumption is easier to be met as sort of a fundamental premise of your theory. And if you look back at, again, some of the overlaying like macroeconomic data around inflationary measures, automation, globalization, hyper efficiency production, the cost of consumer goods has largely gone down. And the only really three drivers of inflation have been education, housing, and healthcare. With education of particular note, where it outpaces inflation by 2.5-fold, in large part because of the bloat in administrative hiring. And so if you actually, again, to your point, the kind of empirical data behind it is because of technology, because of advancements in production, the cost of stuff, like, for example, the most common example is like a television, right? Your like TV and your smartphone, right, has gone significantly down, or the quality has gone up for a commensurate price level. So this is just a fascinating empirical backdrop for what you're suggesting is, well, throughout human history, baked into human psychology, and there's a lot of terms I want you to help us unpack and define, like the idea of, in evolutionary psychology, of costly signaling, because it seems like this really like underpins so much of your writing and contributions, as well as some of the more sort of modern additions like concept creep and the like. But again, like empirically as a foundation, this seems highly, highly compelling, because indeed the costs of consumer goods, electronics, and the sort of conspicuous consumption, right? So stuff that you buy in order to signal to others a particular level of status or hierarchy, or the ability to spend your resources in such a way, has indeed gone down. Whereas education, a highly regulated, highly subsidized, credentialized market, which is a self-regulatory body that whose value is derived from exclusion, right? So all these realms of artificial scarcity, right? The idea that actually, no, Rob, like not every homeless child or foster child can go to Yale, because by design, the slots are finite. This is true not just at the university level. This is true in medical schools. This is true in residency programs. There is a finite fixed supply, fixed set of slots, so as by design to protect the value of that profession or of that credential. So with that as a backdrop, want to throw it back to you to how social status somehow fills this vacuum amidst that context.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. That even though like goods have become over time at least more affordable, education has become less affordable. And I think that's like a perfect example, basically, that like education, which is like a little bit more ephemeral and sort of it's just not a physical item. It's become more important over time.
You can't buy it on Amazon.
Right, basically.
And so, well, so people like Scott Galloway suggest actually that what COVID will help accelerate and unearth is these big tech university partnerships, because what he considers the university is the ultimate luxury good. So Scott has this sort of schema for how Apple, for example, is the ultimate luxury tech item, and how a university is actually the oldest luxury brand of all time with the most durable brand. And he does the calculation of how someone pays essentially like $12,000 to like sit in a class and hear him lecture about like, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and the like. And he says, as a result of COVID, I mean, first off, you're going to see this kind of middle tier being emptied out. And we're seeing this both on a university level, but on a societal level, where the winner take all markets, because of the convergence of technology and capital, winner take all markets where only a handful of cities, a handful of clustering of cities and firms and brands are where all the rewards and all the human capital and financial capital has gone. But again, to your point, like you can't yet buy it on Amazon. Sorry, keep going.
No. That's a great point. And I think like, I mean, even if you could buy it on Amazon, this would still exclude a bunch of people, right? Like most people would not be able to afford, the Amazon Ivy League degree. But in any case, like, I think that's an excellent point, that I think in a way, these luxury beliefs are actually more exclusive. It's harder to break into. And this sort of touches on the idea of costly signals, because like the only way that you can basically talk like a person who went to an elite university is to actually go to an elite university, right? Or I mean, like some of the things that people like, the mindset, the vocabulary, the worldview, like the whole thing is like, even to this day, I'm still learning. Like I don't perfectly fit into this world yet. I'm still learning a lot. And so I think that, and it's not even necessarily by design. It's not like, oh, let's come up with beliefs to keep people out, but it's just sort of organically arose in this way. And it's something that I think affluent people can pay more attention to and realize like the ways that these sort of folk ways and social mores can keep people locked out. The costly signaling. Yeah.
So sorry. So just help us, like, give us some of the most like potent examples of this, where like vocabulary and words and language are used as a signifier of us and them. You're out, I'm in.
I mean, like one is cultural appropriation. So like I had never heard that word or that term before in the first 24 years of my life. No one had ever said cultural appropriation to me. I'd never read it anywhere, seen it anywhere. And then like the first, the first semester at Yale, I must have heard that phrase, a few dozen times. Part of it was because there were like campus protests erupting during that period with, just sort of, student protests. And so that term was getting thrown around a lot. And I tried to like understand, like, what does this mean, cultural appropriation, and why I had never heard it before. And then like, as people are explaining it to me, and I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. Like this is something that you basically have to be educated to believe. I mean, what are some other like beliefs?
Well, I was just going to cite your work, which was the example of the person on Tinder who found.
I was just going to talk about that.
Yeah, go ahead. Go.
Yeah. Oh, I was gonna say like the attitude about sex too. Like it's very interesting. Like basically, so the story of my friend here who also goes to another university, he told me that when he set his Tinder radius to, I don't know, just like a couple of miles, like 5 miles or something around him, most of the women profiles that he encountered were other students, which makes sense. And in their bios of their Tinder profiles, he said that like half of them said that they were poly or polyamorous, basically meaning like I am a person who's open to sleeping with many people at the same time, open relationship kind of. And then he told me when he expanded his radius to like 15 miles to include the rest of his town, which is sort of located in there's like a divide where the university is sort of affluent and then the outskirts are more working class. The women that he matched with who weren't students were, like he said, like at least half of them were single moms. And to me, those two things are not disconnected. I think that basically the attitudes and influence of affluent people, of educated, the credentialed class, their attitudes about sex are that like it should be totally free and no restrictions whatsoever. And in my view, I mean, reading some of the history of this all started sort of like, not all started, but like a big part of it happened in the 1960s, where you had a lot of college students and sort of members of the credentialed class who were pushing for sort of the removal of monogamy and social norms and treating marriage as a sort of oppressive institution and so on. And I mean, okay, like maybe, but then if you look at the actual behavior of this class, it doesn't align, because people in the upper class are more likely to get married, way less likely to have children out of wedlock. And
this is the fascinating divergence that you call attention to, and I want to just again like hammer it home over and over and over with concrete examples, because like one could say, Rob, like, oh well, maybe marriage is indeed this sort of obsolete, patriarchal, what have you, insert term here, institution. But then you say, well, how is it then that those who preach this message don't practice it?
Right. Yeah. And that to me is like, yeah, very interesting that these people who are all about, sexual freedom and everyone should do whatever they want, fine. But then if you look at their actual behavior, they sort of follow the like almost like this sort of like traditional 1950s of like, okay, go to college, make sure I have a job, make sure that I love my spouse and that we're compatible, and then we're going to get married, and then we'll have kids, and it's very responsible. And I can't remember where I heard this phrase, but I think it encapsulates it perfectly, is that members of the elite or the affluent class, they walk the 50s and talk the 60s. And I think that sort of captures what's going on here. And then people might, people have asked me this, well, how are you so sure that their attitudes about sex have impacted the lower classes, the working class, the poor, whatever? And my answer to that is, they basically have like the most influence in society. And so, people who go to Ivy League schools or elite schools, they get to decide sort of what the environment is like, what the sort of norms are, what we see on TV, what we watch in the movie theaters, what books we're consuming, and the sort of like general political and social dialogue is disproportionately influenced by members of the elite. And so over time, right, like, yeah, I think it starts with, influential people, and then it sort of trickles down over time to the lower classes and influences their attitudes as well. Once it became sort of destigmatized to whatever, have a child out of wedlock or something, I think that had a big part in what was going on in why there are so many children raised by single parents in the lower class, in the working class. One of the stats that I find absolutely fascinating, and I put this in the Quillette Luxury Beliefs article, is that in 1963, the upper class and the lower, like, what is it, like the educated and non-college educated basically had roughly the same level of intact marriages. Children were raised basically in intact married families in 1963. And then by 2005, it had completely diverged, such that upper class families had not really changed at all. They were still majority raised by two parents, but lower class kids, it trickled down to something like 30% or 35%, a huge divergence. And I think, like, of course, there are a lot of like economic factors, I'm sure. But the thing is, like, these two classes were the same in 1963. I'm sure that in 1963, the affluent people were still richer, still had more material resources. So even though there may be economic factors here, I think a big part of it is cultural, it's social, it's sort of what people think is okay or not okay to do.
There is, I'm like getting chills listening to you, because there's so many motifs and common threads from past dialectics and other kind of friends of the show, where we had Michael Sandel on recently, and he and also just a general kind of thesis around, well, for the past 4 or 5 decades or so, we have seen this great divergence by many accounts of the separation of returns to capital and returns to labor, of the separation of the increase in GDP and gross domestic product, and the profitability of firms on the stock market, and even life expectancy, where for 3 consistent years before COVID, before Trump, American life expectancy had declined for 3 years. Of course, you see great divergence as to where that's happening. And in large part, it was driven by deaths of despair. So a surge in suicides, opiates, drug overdoses, to the point where they surpassed vehicle deaths. And American life expectancy went down for 3 years for the first time since the Spanish flu. So there is this notion that like real growth, kind of real economic growth, stopped at some point in this kind of 70s or so, this kind of 1 to 2 decade period. And on the economic side, there's the theory that, like, well, we've essentially just been milking past decades of growth post World War II, like massive investments in public infrastructure and public goods and public institutions that have essentially stopped. So the Eric Weinstein kind of theory on this is these institutions, like universities, are built upon an embedded growth obligation. Some need to constantly grow and grow and grow the slate of administrators and so on and so forth. But it's becoming unsustainable. And so what COVID, unfortunately may be unearthing is popping of this bubble, right? Where students are now paying, or families are paying $60,000, $70,000 for, for the fact that 1 in 3 Americans even have a college degree. And we're talking about this tiny, tiny, tiny sliver, fraction of a percent, that's dishing out, hundreds of thousands of dollars for what has become an insurance policy, a sort of Studio 54 nightclub, where the longer the line is outside, the more value it is to be on the inside. But you even draw kind of further inference, having said, for example, advocating for open borders and drug experimentation are good ways of advertising your membership of the elite, because thanks to your wealth and social connections, they will cost you less than me. And you see this in perceptions around immigration policy in particular. And again, that great divergence between the returns to capital in the United States, the returns to shareholders, and the returns to labor, the returns to working people. And you say as well, activism has been a way for useless people to feel important, even if the consequences are counterproductive for those they claim to be helping and damaging to the fabric of society as a whole.
So that's Thomas Sowell, by the way. I love that quote.
I apologize. Yeah. That was you referencing
Thomas Sowell, the great economist. Yeah. But no, I love that quote. And yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And I was thinking about this too, that like you said, I think it's 36% of American adults now have a college degree. And this has climbed a lot. I think in 1970, it was something like 13% of Americans had a college degree. Now it's 36%. And I mean, maybe COVID and a few other factors are going to start to change this, but it looks like it's going to keep growing. And what I've noticed now is that like a lot of my college friends, they are experiencing stress and pressure. Like, oh, now I have to go get an MBA. I have to get a JD. Like I have to distinguish myself somehow because everyone around me, like basically their whole lives, everyone was expected to go to college. Everyone they know has a bachelor's degree. Now, how do you stand out?
Right. But here's the kicker. And surely the kind of graduate or series of graduate degrees has become de facto the new college degree. But the kicker is, while entrance rates into college may have gone up, the graduation, the completion rates have remained stagnant.
Yeah.
And that's the real kicker, where not only do most people who enter college not graduate, nearly half who do graduate are then underemployed, or so working in a job that doesn't require that degree.
Yeah, especially millennials. I think millennials are especially like likely college graduates who are millennials are especially likely to be working in jobs that actually don't require college degrees, but they were told they had to get this piece of paper. And the dropout rate too for college is something that, like, I mean, people are always shocked when I tell them this, that the college dropout rate is something like 42%, 45%, somewhere around there. So nearly half of people who enter college their freshman year do not go to their graduation, right? And so, like, what's going on there? I think a lot of people are basically spending money, oftentimes money that they don't have because they have to take out loans or go into debt somehow to attend college because that's what everyone told them they have to do. And a good portion of them don't finish their degree. And I would imagine the people who don't finish their degree are especially likely to come from sort of lower class backgrounds, right? So it's actually hurting them even more than you might think. And so, yeah, I think this pressure, this society that we've created where everyone has to go to college no matter what is basically getting people to go into debt for things they may not even get the credential. And the credential itself, like you said, you may not even get a job that aligns with it. So the whole college system in many ways is creating a lot of stress and I think like a lot of damage too.
I think one other interesting comparator that parallels this as well is, again, if you think about education, housing, and healthcare as the sort of three core drivers of any inflation, we just have to look back, barely a decade ago at the financial crisis. And what you just described in the context of a college education was literally what happened in the context of mortgage-backed securities and the sale of houses, which ended up collapsing the entire global economy. And we then printed $4 trillion for the institutions that accelerated that and repackaged these junk bonds in the forms of the sale of houses to those who couldn't afford them. And of course, the kicker then was, as it is now, redlining and the sale of houses through mortgage-backed securities disproportionately hurt and harmed African American communities of color the most. And there was no accountability, and essentially we're still reeling more than a decade after from that crisis.
Yeah, zooming like kind of way out here. I mean, to me, it looks like with the financial crisis, with the sort of subprime mortgages, and now with the college loan crisis. I think one way to look at this, and maybe this is somewhat cynical, but basically you have the members of the credentialed class creating a system to extract money from the working class, almost like taking advantage of them by telling them things like, you definitely need to go to college, or you can definitely afford this house, or what have you. Like, basically getting there's this sort of exploitative element to this, and maybe it's not done with malice or with ill intent. I mean, it's just sort of what people are doing. It's just the system, but it's something that maybe we could reflect more on and think more about. And then I just remembered this other stat about college dropout rate. So if you look at community college, which is, there's probably not even that many middle class people going to community college, but the dropout rate in community colleges is upwards of 60%. So and in California, it's 70%, my home state. And so a place like that where it's sort of advertised, especially like in my high school, so on a personal level, like I remember my teachers telling me like, well, military, but also community college, that's sort of sold to working class kids and to kids who maybe aren't quite ready to be students yet, right? Someone like me, I definitely wasn't ready to be a student when I was 17. But there were people, adults in my life, including my mom too. I mean, like, and I don't even blame them. You know, that's just the culture, go to college. But I can tell you that I would have been wasting money if I had taken out loans. I wouldn't have finished my degree, at least, you know, not anytime soon. So I think, yeah, telling people college at all costs or college no matter what is detrimental.
And I want to also, to that point about kind of zooming out, the reason I think this is so important and, you know, taking the time to unearth, you know, perhaps, you know, whether you call it hypocrisy or inconsistency or unintended consequences of, you know, a series or decades of policies or a particular vision is this actually Confucian concept of the rectification of names, which is calling things as they are and just being objective in our observations about reality is sort of the foundational first step to be able to do anything about it. Because if we can't observe the $1.6 trillion student debt crisis and call it for what it is, call the bubble for what it is, then it'll be much more difficult to do anything about it, particularly when, if you look at this past Democratic primary as an example, nearly every single set of solutions revolved around, well, we just need to send more kids to college, or college is the answer. So that's just a little kind of footer there where, again, being able to call out things as they are is part and parcel of being able to offer solutions and offer an alternative.
Yeah, sometimes I get a little discouraged. I mean, I definitely think that's important. And I think like conversations like this are ways to underscore this, that like looking at reality on reality's terms is important. But so many people, highly educated people, are, I think like we've sort of been educated to think that, you know, reality is subjective, and that and if we can basically, if we can change the way we think about reality, then reality will change somehow. Like, oh, if I suddenly think that, you know, if I believe hard enough that everyone should go to college and the college loan crisis is not a crisis, and we can just hope our way out of it, or change the name of it somehow, don't call it college loan, call it something else, then it won't be a problem anymore. And I think like a lot of people in top universities in particular are sort of maybe trained or enculturated to think in this way of like, change the name, change the label, update the you know, name of this movement or this problem or this trend or whatever, and
call it a derivative, call it a mortgage-backed security.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And no one knows what that means, but it sounds sophisticated, and you know that means we're sophisticated enough to handle the problem or something. And I think that because of that way of thinking of subjective and soft reality, it becomes harder to actually take reality on its own terms until something like coronavirus happens, right? Like early on, people were debating and getting into the politics of the virus and whether the other team is not reacting to it appropriately. And I think people who were thinking that way were still stuck in that soft reality, like mental frame, instead of looking at it as a pandemic.
So this is, I think, an excellent and critical bridge because, you know, we're based here in New York City in the United States. The worst of the worst of the worst offenders for negligence and malfeasance when it comes to COVID. Highest infection rates, highest fatality rates. We're talking about a mayor, a health commissioner, a state, a governor, not to mention a president, and a surgeon general and a World Health Organization, Rob, that said masks do not work. Masks do not work to protect against transmission of a respiratory disease. And this is as late as March 20th on public record. in the middle of the pandemic. This pandemic that has killed more Americans than died in the Vietnam War. This pandemic that is slated to kill and lead to a 9/11 death toll every single day. Our Congress has been on recess in the United States. Our federal legislature has been asleep at the switch. Mm-hmm. All the while, the former CDC director said if New York City, Rob, had shut down just 10 days sooner, 50 to 80% of all deaths could have been avoided.
Wow.
So there is no, it's like one thing for us to exist in the realm of ideas and kind of the theory of luxury beliefs and the importance and the role of status and how these inconsistencies and hypocrisy, they're so frustrating. We're talking about, 1 million Americans dead by the end of the year. We're talking about, again, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives that could have been saved if we had looked reality in its face and shut down just 10 days sooner. And literally the city health commissioner said, this is beginning of March, after COVID fully came online, ride the subways, ride the buses, go to Chinatown, go to the businesses, don't be racist.
Yeah. I remember those. I remember seeing the tweets, I think, from de Blasio and some of the other like New York State officials too, saying go to the movies and all the stuff that you were saying. And I remember even at that time being confused. So yeah, early on, like once I started reading about what was going on in Wuhan and then, eventually what happened in Italy, I think that, for me, like I was actually like stockpiling food and stuff and water, and I was getting really nervous in early February. And yeah, to see the sort of reaction from, people who are supposed to be in charge and people who are supposed to inform us, it was really kind of scary, actually, that they were telling us that masks don't work or that this virus isn't this virus is just going to disappear or go away, or it's not going to be a problem. Or at one point, and this was here in the UK, but kind of a similar line of thinking, though, at one point, the idea was herd immunity. We're just going to not do anything. And then eventually we're all going to be immune to it anyway. So let's just live life and pretend it doesn't exist. And I think a lot of that was based on that sort of belief in soft reality that I cited earlier, that if we can just think it away, then it will go away. And we are not used to dealing with reality that exists independent of us, that this virus is going to exist whether we want it to or not. And we actually have to deal with it. And we can't, we're not going to solve the problem by changing people's minds necessarily. That can, in terms of social distancing and stuff, that can help. But the virus isn't going to go away because, I persuaded someone something, right?
Or if you change the words to describe it. Right. I want to harken back to your original piece on which ties in Veblen's work on the theory of the leisure class. And this just stood out to me in this context. And I think it was you who said, or who wrote, I'm so healthy. And this is kind of in reference to the role of status symbols. Perhaps this is Veblen. I'm so healthy that I can afford to poison my body and continue to function.
Right. Yeah. I took that from, I think, Jared Diamond, who's, I think, a historian and anthropologist. He wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel. But yeah, he had this interesting idea that maybe one reason why people sort of drink and do drugs and smoke and sort of do things that we all kind of know are bad for our bodies and for our health, but do it in a very public way too. Especially smoking has been pretty much stigmatized in the upper class, but until recently, smoking, we would publicly smoke even after we knew it was bad for us. And the idea is I'm so healthy, I'm so strong that I can afford to take these incredible risks. And I think that especially young men will do things that are dangerous and everyone knows it's dangerous, and they sort of revel in it because of its danger. And I think the sort of underlying ultimate evolutionary reason for a lot of that is basically to display fitness. Things like riding a motorcycle or skydiving or parasailing or all these kinds of crazy things. Yeah.
Break down some of those terms like fitness and adaptive value. And just because these are kind of jargony evolutionary psychology terms that carry a lot of weight and importance, but just help us break down some of these terms. referring
I mean,
to.
like, okay, so like fitness signals. I mean, okay, so I guess we would have to like zoom back to like almost like foundational evolutionary theory. But basically, you know, like what is like the idea from starting with Darwin was that people and organisms are here because they've survived and reproduced long enough, and the process of evolution is such that, you know, our features, our bodies, our sort of physical characteristics have been shaped by selective pressures. And that's sort of like why we are the way we are now, is because, and this is important because at some point in our evolutionary history, they were advantageous. And I think like that's an important point to make, because a lot of people think that because like when we say like something has adaptive value or is you know evolutionarily fit, we're saying that it's fit now today, but it's not. Basically, the way that we are today was adaptive in the Pleistocene or whenever it was, like whatever your sort of cutoff date was for when sort of humans sort of expanded around the world. But you know, early Homo sapiens, this is what was advantageous for them. And an important part of evolutionary theory, at least as it relates to humans, is sort of social selection, sexual selection, how humans have gotten along up until now, even though, I mean, if you look at humans, like an individual human, we're actually pretty pathetic physically, right? Like we're weak, we don't have claws, everything about us is kind of like, in comparison to a lot of other large mammals, is kind of, you know, sad. But the reason we've been able to survive is through cooperation. Humans are intensely social. There are interesting theories called, I think, so there's some people call it the social brain hypothesis, some call it the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis, which is basically that our smarts, our intelligence, our ability to figure things out, this came about basically because humans have been around other intelligent apes, and this created a sort of runaway competition effect where people are around other intelligent beings, and the ones who were able to sort of navigate that intensely social environment, basically like, yeah, we are beneficiaries of that, and we have this these big brains to solve social problems, to sort of infer emotions, figure out what other people are thinking. You know, it's referred to in like theory of mind, sort of taking the perspectives of other people and thinking 2 steps ahead of them, because not only are these the people around us our fellow sort of people that we need to cooperate with to survive, but oftentimes they're also competitors. And so in order to maintain our status in a community, we have to figure out what other people are thinking and to sort of think what they're going to do and try to jump ahead of them. And so all of those things come into play for things like fitness signals, right? Like, how do I sort of stand out in this community of others? Sexual selection is another big part of this. I mean, in short, like basically the idea behind sexual selection is like, not only did we evolve from natural selection pressures, but also through sort of mating pressures, trying to impress members of the opposite sex. In evolutionary psychology, this is specifically for
peacocking.
Yeah, like sort of peacocking. Yeah, I mean, the idea from the peacocks, right? Like they have these big, beautiful tails, and this is used to attract mates. And so for humans, for males, a lot of evolutionary psychologists have posited that a lot of the things that men do are basically to attract women. And, you know, and one thing that's important to keep in mind here is that almost none of this is conscious. This is all sort of going on under the hood, so to speak. But a lot of these things do kind of, in evolutionary terms, explain a lot of behavior, and I'm you know, partially biased because I'm more interested in the sort of how it explains male behavior and young male behavior, because, you know, I'm a man, and then also because today, as I look back on some of the things that I did, I think like, yeah, why was I doing all of those dumb things, and you know, why did it feel good to do it at the time? So yeah, and then what was the other? So the fitness indicators, costly signals. So yeah, and costly signals are basically things that an organism, like only an organism who's especially fit, can afford to do. So to go back to the peacock's tail, only a healthy bird would be able to grow such a long, luxurious set of tail feathers. And so when peahens are evaluating them, you know, they're aware, you know, they're not conscious, but they sort of understand this. on a deep level that only healthy birds can do that. And I think this is also true for human beings as well. Things like our sense of humor, our intellect, our strength, our bodies, all of those things are important. Yeah.
This is so critical and really so foundational, in part because, again, if we go to this sort of 1960s, 1970s divergence, or this kind of neoliberal consensus that has dominated our politics and our policy, is the Chicago Economic School theory that of human beings as widgets, as all the sort of assumptions baked into classical economics that we are rational actors. And going back to your first, part of the conversation, we respond to money. And this has been complicated and really, in some ways, torn up just over the past decade of research by Kahneman and Tversky and all their sort of all the kind of scholars that came after again, who really invented the field of behavioral economics. But it's all rooted in this fundamental, really evolutionary theory of human beings as social, as fundamentally what distinguishes us, what distinguishes Homo sapiens in solving all these coordination problems is our communication and social skill. And I think this has so many ramifications, because if policymakers, if academics and the like have a fundamental belief, this like singular siloed belief of human beings as economic widgets, as inputs into a capital efficiency machine, then you're going to see all sorts of, whacked up incentives and systems and institutions, because that's just not how people work.
Yeah. I think that kind of like free market economic sort of like libertarian mindset about what drives people. It probably has had like an outsized effect on the way people think about what people respond to and what's important to people. That it's all been discussions about money and income and growth and things like, sort of social connections and relationships, families, friends, communities. That's been overlooked because, one thing is people have found ways to do this, but generally speaking, it's very hard to measure, right? You can't like directly measure it the way that you can with income or with education or something, right? Like measuring maybe the number of relationships, but also the quality. How do you measure quality of relationships? And yeah.
No, so to this point, this is really fundamental, because the idea of what we measure is what we do and what we pursue is, well, in some sense, we actually do have metrics, right? And if you look at life expectancy measures, if you look at quality of life reported measures, yes, some of these metrics are self-reported and they're like qualified in that way. But to your point is, we've basically only been optimizing for one single variable, which is returns to capital, right? Returns to profitability for firms. One of the challenges is, though, maybe for a while, that was a good proxy, a good heuristic, a good kind of rule of thumb for, well, how are people doing, right? If my firm increases its bottom line, increases its return to shareholders, that must mean I'm hiring locally, I'm investing in my community, and giving something of value to people. But as that has been decoupled and delinked, you can have a firm like Uber, Facebook, Amazon, Google, Netflix, you name it, where actually, if you put out, millions, tens of millions of people who work in truck driving or transportation out of work, that's phenomenal for returns to capital. That's phenomenal for that singular variable of how profitable your firm is. But that is devastating to tens of millions of people whose livelihood, whose community, whose family is dependent upon that as a source of income. And it's in part why, an idea like a universal basic income, it's about everything but the money. It's about what the money means in people's hands, because of the social connections of a community, a school, a main street of a local economy. In a country where half of all people before COVID couldn't afford an unexpected $500 bill. And now we've entered the next Great Depression with more than 40 million, by some accounts, more than 75 million people unemployed. And so this is a deeply social, human, interpersonal reality, because if you go to any of these communities, I was based in Iowa for the Yang campaign, you go to any of these communities built upon the industrial Midwest, upon manufacturing. The most common job in the American economy is still working in retail. 100% of all stores and malls are now shuttering. And so this is the fundamental reality, because it not only affects, that part of the economy, that sector, that then trickles and percolates throughout a person, their family, their school, their community, their city. And it just tears it apart. It tears it apart.
Yeah. And I think, people are apt to underestimate the importance of sort of feeling like a valued member of the community through, providing for their family, for their loved ones, and so on. And I think also like this focus on economics, and maybe this sort of overturns some of what I said earlier, but I think this focus on economics has almost made at least parts of it come true. One would be like, maybe in the 60s and 70s, we started focusing more on the importance of basically economics, and overlook the importance of social norms, for example. As a result of that, like the numbers of people who went to prison skyrocketed, like the amount of crime. I think in the 90s it dipped a little bit, but we're still way higher than we were pre-1960s. And I think this basically, like, we're paying for that, right? Like, we're sort of paying for the erosion of a lot of social norms. I highlight this in one of the pieces I wrote in the New York Post that 3% of college, of foster kids graduate from college, but something like 60% get involved with the criminal justice system at some point. And about half of boys in foster care are arrested at least once by the time they're 17. So they're not even adults yet. They've like half have already been arrested, right? And so I think that a lot of this erosion of norms and overlooking the importance of taking care of kids and setting good examples for them, basically we're ending up having to pay for it. I think we actually have to, in a way, like, pay with money for our luxury beliefs.
Doubly and triply so. We pay so much more on the back end when our people hit our institutions. And instead of investing on the front end in whole, strong children and people, I mean, there's been well-documented evidence now on just the power of direct cash into children's and families' hands. And what you see is an improvement in nutrition, in mental health, in graduation rates, because so much of the variance in school outcome is dependent upon your family structure, your family, words read to you, right? Like fundamental tenets that can't be provided for just by a teacher in the school. And then, one study showed that $700 billion, that's the return on eradicating child poverty. And on an annual continuous basis on growth in GDP, just on health and education outcomes alone. And so, again, to your point, it's not even theoretical. It's just the stark reality in the data is that if you invest in people and you create the conditions, to your point about family structure, the conditions at home, then we pay and we get leaps and bounds in benefits on that investment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I definitely. So I think you touched on this sort of UBI idea, and I actually haven't made up my mind about that yet. I think that it could be good for people, and there are like some conservatives who are very much like pro UBI. But I also would like to focus on some of the social aspects of this, the cultural aspects. I think that there are people who could benefit from both, right? Like a sort of cash in hand, but also sort of reminders of what can lead to happiness. There's some interesting research on this. I mean, of course, like there's some like I cited the research earlier about how local income affects happiness more than absolute income. But in terms of lasting happiness, sort of happiness that extends beyond 3 months, it actually comes down to, for the most part, relationships.
Yep.
So I can't remember. There was an economist who looked at this, but basically sort of look at a bunch of different factors for what could potentially make someone happy and what could potentially make someone sad. Things like getting promoted, getting fired, getting married, and so on. And what they found, so they found three things that predicted happiness beyond 3 months. One of them was getting married. The other was having children. And the third thing was a large financial windfall. And this was something like an inheritance or winning the lottery. And there were three things that predicted negative emotion or sadness beyond 3 months. And one was divorce or the death of a spouse or a child, and major financial loss like declaring bankruptcy, right? So of course, like money was a factor in both happiness and sadness, but two of those three things had to do with relationships with family. And things like job promotions or getting fired or those kinds of things, they predicted sort of short-term happiness or sadness, but beyond about 3 months, those things actually didn't affect people very much. This is sort of like the affective forecasting work too by Dan Gilbert and so on. So I think that this is also like, if we're looking at not just, how to make people richer, I guess, but also how to make people happier, like what makes our citizens happiest, finding ways to sort of, I think promote families and relationships and social capital. That's also important.
Absolutely. I want to quote you quoting Durkheim this time, and then also ask you just kind of directly to that point. But just first, that quote. The more one has, the more one wants, since satisfactions received only stimulate instead of filling needs. And in a paper, researchers concluded that relative to lower class individuals, upper class individuals have a greater desire for wealth and status. It is those who have more to start with who also strive to acquire more with wealth and status. Yeah. So, I mean, all right, Rob, let's say you waved your magic wand, right? You were able to implement the evidence-based cost-benefit analysis run policy to promote thick social capital, to promote the priorities of true drivers of sustained joy. What might that be?
Yeah. I mean, so that study, in like the Durkheim quote, and then the study. I mean, so let me see if I can untangle some of this. But basically, members of the upper class care more about wealth and status, and I write in there that like for many of them, that's how they got to their positions in the first place, right? Like, a lot of members of the credential class, like you can only get there if you already cared about those things more than average in some ways. But I think the things that we value in society right now might be feeding into some of the problems that we have. Like so basically, like, what are the markers of status in society today? I'm curious how many people in the upper class would say being a reliable father, or being a mom who's there for her children, or getting married before you have kids, things like that, right? I think a lot of people, is like, if you ask them like what classifies success or what makes someone a prestigious or high status person, well, I think a lot of them would say like getting into the right college and getting certain kinds of occupations, and I don't know, just sort of like these external markers of success that really only like, I don't know, 10 or 15% of the population is in the position to obtain anyway. Those are the things, right? But I think that we could maybe redirect our focus on what is considered high status or prestigious or, admired or respected in society. And we could like sort of go back to, well, being a good parent, or sort of taking care of your kids, or making sure that they're in the best environment, right? And I think that can get overlooked sometimes. I just think that we could rethink what we consider admirable in society.
One other, I think, area of note, and I'm conscious of the time as well, that you cite to, which I think again is fascinating in the context of these kind of multi-decade trends and shifts in the family structure, but also in religion. And you say that one other luxury belief is that religion is irrational or harmful, and members of the upper class are most likely to be atheists or non-religious, but they in turn have the resources and access to thrive without the unifying social edifice of religion. And you also share that places of worship are often essential for the social fabric of poorer communities. Denigrating the importance of religion actually harms the poor.
Yeah. I think that, well, I mean, like, I don't think this, like, a lot of the research bears this out. And then if you just talk to people, right, like, basically in many communities, the local church or the local, places of worship are very important to people. And I think that sort of denigrating that or treating that as you know, in a sort of condescending or patronizing way, as a lot of educated people are apt to do, or very sort of like, you know, blatantly, like, they say that it's important, or they say that it's something that they value, but it's clearly lip service. I think that treatment of religion is not. I think it can be detrimental, basically, for a lot of working class and poor communities. The reluctance, to basically acknowledge that religion can be important in people's lives too. I think that it's this was from Arthur Brooks, he's former president of AEI. I think he's you know, author, well-known guy. He said that, I mean, there are like 4 different pillars for human flourishing, and you don't necessarily need all of them, but you definitely need one of them. And they were family, faith, vocation, and community. And so if you don't have, you know, all 4 of them, that's okay. But if you have one of them, then you can live a life that you're satisfied with. And I think that there are, basically, like, I mean, I worked a lot of these kinds of jobs. Like, I was a dishwasher. I worked in a grocery store. Like, I was, like, you know, sort of doing these kinds of jobs.
You were an essential worker, Rob.
I was an essential worker at one point. Now I'm just like a guy typing on my computer. But and those jobs are important, but in and of themselves, they're actually, like, kind of mundane, and, like, you know, it's not the most exciting job in the world to wash other people's dishes. But if there's meaning behind it, if you're doing it for your family or for your community, or, like, there's a sense of pride that comes along with it, and you're not just doing it for the paycheck, I think that can instill those kinds of things with importance. And so basically the only people who can have, like, jobs that are in and of themselves meaningful without having to be connected to relationships are, like, basically the professional class, right? Like, a lot of, you know, people can find meaning directly in their work if you're a member of, like, a very privileged group. But in order for sort of working class jobs to have meaning beyond the job itself, they have to be connected, I think, to other people. There has to be a relationship that they're also working for. And so, I think keeping that in mind is important too, that, you know, the family, faith, vocation, community thing, well, maybe if the vocation isn't the most exciting vocation, if it affects, you know, some of those other 3 pillars, then you can have a meaningful life.
And it's tragic but fascinating that all 4 of those seem to have been simultaneously eroded at their core. One final luxury belief that I'll drop on from yours, and then please feel free to add whatever you think we may have missed, but this one's really a kicker. And we alluded to this earlier. You say, then there is the luxury belief that individual decisions don't matter much compared to random social forces, including luck. This belief is more common among many of my peers at Yale and Cambridge than the kids I grew up with in foster care, or the folks I served with in the military. The key message is what in psychology is called an external locus of control, or rather that the outcomes of your life are beyond your control. This idea works to benefit the upper class and harms ordinary people. If disadvantaged people believe random chance is the key factor for success, they'll be less likely to strive.
Yeah, I think that's a damaging message to. So whether, I mean, like it's very clear that, like, when we talked about this earlier, that luck does play a role in all of our lives, but to say that like it's all luck or mostly luck, or that, you know, the things that you can actually do and control in your daily life, those things just aren't as important. I think that's a damaging message. If someone had told me, like, fortunately, like I guess like the adults around me, that might have been another factor too for me, was that like the adults around me were like more or less encouraging. They said like a lot of teachers sort of recognized that I was kind of a curious kid, that maybe I had a chance, and they would encourage me to work harder and apply myself. But if those same people or some adults around me, or the general sort of cultural message was like, oh, like, you know, there's this system in place and there's this conspiracy to hold you back, or if they had said like, you know, it's all just luck and there's not much you can do about it and you're born this way and there's nothing you can ever do to change, I don't know how I would have reacted to that. But probably, you know, you and I may not be having this conversation if someone had gotten a hold of me when I was 15 and said like, it's all just luck, man, and the system is what it is, and the people at the top are just, you know, they're there because that's just, you know, they're lucky, they didn't work for that, or you're not going to get there. And so I think we should stress more like, what can you actually do physically in your daily life? Maybe mindset shifts, like all of those things are important. And of course, like, everyone starts out differently. Everyone has different amounts of access and resources and different amounts of luck. But yeah, we have some control, and I think that's also important to stress as well. But yeah, a lot of educated people, I think, are either like uncomfortable with the position that they find themselves in and want to downplay it. I also think like there's a sort of status thing going on here too, where, and I haven't thought this through yet, and I'll just float this idea out there, and maybe it's not like bulletproof, but I have this idea that when you're sort of like striving, you sort of, and you're sort of on your way, you want to convince people that it's about hard work and that you're working really hard, and especially if you need help from other people, you have to convince them that you're going to work hard too if you want them to hire you or whatever. But once you're there, once you sort of made it, I think it sounds like kind of like gauche, or it sounds like people aren't going to like you as much. I think if you said like, I worked my ass off to get here, I think people sense that this is going to turn people off, and so they switch and become humble, because that will sort of get people to lower their guards and will make you more appealing to them. And maybe this isn't wrong. Like, maybe this is a perfectly reasonable strategy, and maybe this isn't even totally right. But this is sort of the sense that I get from people, especially like highly successful people who I know for a fact worked really hard, but they do this humble routine.
Yeah, I mean, it's very apropos in this time of commencement speeches, where the sort of classic commencement speaker, the kind of classic graduation speaker, I think as Scott Galloway put it, is a billionaire or a famous person who tells you just pursue their passion, even though that's exactly the opposite of what they did. They sold software as a service or like made widgets or inputs into steel manufacturing, and then had infinite capital to, promulgate and disseminate their kind of worldview. But I think one kind of layer on top of this that has been, absent even from that critique is, outside of individual wealth maximization, there's also this element of the common good and doing something, beyond oneself. And even in that context, that hypocrisy or that inconsistency or that artifice around what it takes to build an organization, what it takes to build anything, is detrimental and harmful, and just even aligning and cohering like truth and reality as it is. can be powerful into its own right.
Yeah. That's a good point. And I think that, as I sort of like think about the general like concept of luxury beliefs, it's, none of the stuff that I've written about or said, like, it's not necessarily new, but it's something that I think we should all like maybe like it's worth sort of reflecting on a lot of this, and maybe like I did coin the term luxury beliefs, but the idea behind it, like, it's been expressed in multiple ways by multiple different people before, and I think, members of the sort of privileged segment of society could sort of think about whether their own beliefs and the things that we say and the influence that we wield, whether it's having an overall positive or overall negative effect. I mean, like, a simple example of this is just like the way people act on Twitter, for example. I think a lot of, especially in the lockdown, we're all kind of inside, like it's bringing out, I mean, Twitter was already kind of toxic in a lot of ways before, but now like people are spending more time on there. And like, it just blows my mind. Like, and I probably, even though I'm only 30, but I probably sound like an old man speaking this way, but it blows my mind when I see like 40-year-olds, like fully grown adults, like the things that they are willing to post on social media. It just like, I just can't believe it. Like, I can't believe these are adults. And then I think, like, what if I had seen, a 45-year-old man acting this way on social media when I was like 11 years old? Like, what would I think? And because back then, like, in some ways, adults were like, as a kid, you think of adults as like, oh, they're sort of, you're supposed to like listen to them or whatever. Even though I often didn't, I did have like this underlying respect for adults in some way. But I think today maybe I wouldn't, simply because of like the way people act, the way politicians act. It would be nice to just sort of like bring back adults.
Yeah, I mean, there is so much more we could get into. I'll just say two quick things on that. One of the things we've said now for a while, which is the reality, which is there actually are no adults in the wings. And it's really incumbent upon us, on all of us, to build and rebuild the institutions that are crumbling beneath the weight. And I think one recent example in the realm of social psychology research is Jonathan Haidt and Jean Twenge's work on the effects of social media on anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, self-harm, and the sort of devolution and regression to the sort of pettiness and base level. Again, like one other framing we didn't even get to is the kind of system 1 and system 2, the sort of base level elephant and the rider, the sort of biological wiring that's been, hardwired into our evolutionary being, and our sort of metacognitive mind on top of that, the slow system that's reasoning and the fast system that boils our blood. And these technologies that are on their face ambivalent, their destructive power can be unleashed at a much faster pace than their creative potential. And we're seeing this in the comment threads of Twitter and the like, the cesspool of humanity.
And then just like, I mean, not even on Twitter, like the general sort of political discussion. Like, to be honest, like, I follow very few political people on Twitter, simply because like I can't stand it. But then, like, even in real life, if you see, someone in a press conference or something, like it's just like 90% toxic. And it makes me wonder, like, what do kids think when they're seeing all of this?
Right. Well, we are so grateful to you, Rob, for being a very rare voice of reason amidst this all, especially and in particular coming from the social psychology department. I am so grateful to you again. You have to follow Rob on Twitter at Rob K. Henderson. He just posts these incredible, sometimes hilarious, sometimes depressing nuggets of wisdom, all with the data and citation to back it. And sign up for his newsletter. Like, subscribe, and comment to this video so you can hear first about our upcoming dialectics. But really, again, thank you so much, Rob. And I'll let you, if you have any closing thoughts, reflections, or anything else you wanted to share.
No, this was great, Jonathan. Thank you.
Amazing. Take care, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.